The most powerful woman in Europe just stood in front of the entire world, and for the first time in years, she had no control. Ursula von der Leyen, the woman who commanded over 450 million people, who challenged global tech giants, who spoke with absolute authority on the world stage, not because she didn't understand the question, but because she understood it too well. Because this time, the evidence wasn't hidden, it wasn't buried in reports or locked behind procedures, it was right there, in front of her, on the screen behind her, where everyone could see it. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in that room, but across an entire continent. Because power only works as long as people believe in it, and for the first time, that belief started to crack. To understand how it reached this point, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the public image, not the speeches, the real beginning. When she rose to power in 2019, it didn't happen through overwhelming public support. It happened quietly, strategically, through negotiations behind closed doors. She wasn't the obvious choice, she wasn't the candidate people expected, but she was the one leaders believed they could rely on. Control, stability, predictability. That was the calculation. And it worked. Barely. The margin that placed her at the top was razor thin, just enough to win, but not enough to truly secure loyalty. And that matters, because when power starts from compromise, it always carries a weakness inside it. But once she stepped into that position, she didn't act cautiously, she expanded. Decision-making became centralized, authority tightened around a smaller circle. Processes that once involved multiple layers began narrowing, slowly at first, then more clearly. And most people didn't notice, because on the surface everything looked stable, policies moved forward, statements were strong, the image remained intact. But underneath, the structure was changing, and structures matter. Because when they're bypassed, it doesn't show immediately, it shows later, all at once. The first visible crack came in a moment that seemed symbolic, but revealed something deeper. During a high-level diplomatic visit, the image of her being physically sidelined in a room meant to represent equal power spread across the world. It looked like a protocol issue, a mistake, something temporary, but the reaction to it mattered more than the event itself, because nothing changed. No accountability, no correction. The moment passed, and the system continued exactly as it had before. And that pattern, absorb the impact, avoid consequences, move forward, became consistent. Then came the decision that would define everything that followed. During one of the most critical global crises, a deal was made. Massive, historic, the kind of decision that affects millions of lives and billions in public money. And instead of following the full, transparent process designed for decisions of that scale, it was handled differently, more directly, more privately. Conversations happened outside the usual channels. Documentation wasn't preserved the way it should have been. And at the time, it didn't explode, because urgency can hide a lot. Crisis creates cover, and when results are delivered, questions often get delayed. But delayed doesn't mean erased, because questions have a way of coming back, and when they do, they come back stronger. Journalists started asking, investigators pushed further, requests were made, and the answers didn't match. Information was missing, records couldn't be produced, explanations became technical, complicated, just enough to slow everything down. And for a while, it worked, because systems are built to protect themselves, procedures can delay, complexity can confuse, and attention can move on. But not everyone moved on. Some people stayed on it, quietly, patiently, building something piece by piece, document by document, because they understood something important. Truth doesn't need speed, it needs precision, and precision takes time. Years passed, pressure built slowly, but it never disappeared, and then everything aligned. Evidence that was never supposed to surface, surfaced. Information that was supposed to remain fragmented, connected, and suddenly what had been dismissed as scattered concerns turned into a complete picture. And that picture was about to be revealed in the one place where it couldn't be ignored. Inside the European Parliament, live, unfiltered, and directly in front of her.
Because power can manage criticism, it can handle opposition, it can even survive scandal. But what it cannot survive is undeniable evidence appearing at the exact moment it has to answer for it. And that's exactly where she was standing, at that podium, with nowhere left to redirect, nowhere left to delay, and no way to control what was about to happen next.
And then it happened. The moment that had been building for years didn't arrive slowly, it arrived all at once. The chamber was already tense but controlled, structured, predictable. And then the screen behind her changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. A document appeared, then another, and in seconds the entire atmosphere shifted. Because what was being shown wasn't interpretation, it wasn't opinion, it was internal, direct, precise, and impossible to ignore. At first she didn't react, not visibly. Years in power had trained her to maintain composure, to absorb pressure without revealing anything. Her posture remained steady, her expression controlled. But control only works when the situation is manageable, and this wasn't manageable, because the documents didn't ask questions, they answered them. The timeline began forming right there in front of everyone. Decisions that were publicly described one way were shown to have happened differently behind closed doors. Processes that were supposed to involve oversight had been narrowed. Instructions had been given, directions had been followed, and the pattern became clear within moments. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't a gap, it was deliberate. The room felt it immediately. You could sense the shift from curiosity to recognition. Because once people understand what they're looking at, they don't need explanation anymore. They start connecting it themselves, and that's when momentum begins. A voice broke the silence, then another, then several more, not coordinated, not planned, but aligned. Members from different sides who had spent years disagreeing on everything were now reacting to the same thing at the same time. That kind of alignment doesn't happen easily. It only happens when the evidence is strong enough to override everything else. She reached for her notes, adjusted the microphone, began to speak. And for a brief moment it seemed like she might regain control. The familiar tone returned, structured language, careful wording, references to procedures, ongoing matters, legal boundaries, all the mechanisms used to stabilize a situation. But this time they didn't work, because the gap was too visible. What she was saying didn't match what was on the screen, and everyone could see it. Not later, not after analysis, right there, in real time. And once that gap appears in front of a live audience, it cannot be closed. The interruptions started. At first, controlled. Requests for clarification, direct questions, specific points. But as she continued, the responses didn't land. They circled, redirected, avoided, and the room began to lose patience. Then the tone changed. Voices became sharper, louder, more direct. Not aggressive for the sake of it, but focused, demanding answers that were no longer being given. The session chair attempted to intervene, called for order, requested structure, but structure depends on cooperation, and cooperation depends on trust. And in that moment, trust was gone. Because what was being revealed wasn't just about a single decision, it was about how decisions had been made, and if that process had been bypassed once, then how many other times had it happened? That question didn't need to be asked out loud, it was already understood across the room. She paused, just for a second, but it was enough, because that pause carried weight. It signaled something had changed, that the usual responses were no longer sufficient, that the situation had moved beyond control. She tried again, another attempt to respond, another effort to stabilize, but the momentum had already shifted. And once momentum shifts in a room like that, it doesn't reverse, it accelerates. Members stood, others leaned forward, some remained seated but visibly engaged in a way they hadn't been before. Even those who would normally defend her stayed silent, and that silence was louder than anything else. Because support wasn't coming, and without support,
Power isolates quickly. You could see it now, not in what she said, but in what she couldn't say. The structure of her response began to break. Sentences didn't land the way they were intended. The clarity was gone, the control had slipped, and the room felt it. Then came the moment. Mid-response, her voice stopped, completely. No transition, no recovery, just silence. And in that silence, everything became clear. There was nothing left that could repair what had just been exposed. The room reacted instantly, not chaotic, but unified. Voices rising together, not in confusion, but in certainty, because they had seen enough. The pressure wasn't building anymore. It had arrived. She looked across the chamber, and for the first time there was no path forward, no angle to shift, no narrative to regain, just the reality of the moment, closing in from every direction. She gathered her nates, slowly, deliberately, but without the precision she had maintained for years. Someone behind her leaned in, a brief exchange, quiet but urgent, and then the decision was made. She stepped back, turned, and walked away. No conclusion, no final statement, no attempt to hold the room. Just a walk, measured but final. And that changed everything. Because walking away in that moment doesn't end the situation, it confirms it. It tells everyone watching that the situation has moved beyond control. And outside that chamber, the reaction was immediate. Clips spread across millions of screens within minutes, different angles, different perspectives, but the same moment. The pause, the silence, the walk. People who had never followed this story were now fully engaged because they didn't need context anymore. They had seen enough to understand what it meant. And once public attention locks on to a moment like that, it doesn't let go. Questions turned into demands, demands turned into pressure, and pressure began moving through institutions. Statements were released, carefully at first, then more direct, then unavoidable. Behind the scenes, the real shift began. Conversations changed, positions adjusted, support recalculated. Because in politics, support is never permanent. It exists as long as it's sustainable, and the moment it becomes a liability, it disappears, quietly, then suddenly. By the end of that day, the situation had transformed completely. This was no longer about a single document or a single moment. It was about credibility, authority, and whether either could survive what had just happened. Because once doubt reaches that level, it spreads, and once it spreads, it becomes impossible to contain. Right now, the outcome is still unfolding, but one thing is certain. The control she built over years collapsed in minutes, and whatever happens next will be defined by the moment she stood in front of the world and could no longer answer.